I spent 7 years believing that one day I would finally walk to my front door and see the people I loved waiting for me. Every cold night in the military, every dangerous mission, every lonely birthday, I survived because of one promise. Emily would be there. My family would be there. Home would still be home. The only thing I carried back was a worn backpack, an engagement ring I had protected through every battle. But when I finally returned, I realized the war hadn't taken everything from me. The people I trusted had already done that. The woman I loved was no longer waiting for me. She had become my elder brother's wife, and the child standing beside her looked at me like I was a complete stranger. That was the moment I understood. Sometimes the deepest wounds are not made on the battlefield. They are made at home. The cold wooden bench inside the abandoned train station became my bed that night. I pulled my jacket tighter around my shoulders, but nothing could stop the pain inside me. I really came home for this, I whispered to myself. I closed my eyes, and Emily's smile appeared in my mind. I'll wait for you, she had promised before I left. Asterisk, no matter how long it takes. Asterisk, I had believed every word. Now she was my brother's wife. I laughed quietly. What a fool I was. Sleep never came. Every passing train reminded me that life kept moving while mine had stopped 7 years ago. When morning arrived, I walked through my old neighborhood without knowing where I was going. Most people stared at me with surprise. Some whispered my name. Others quickly looked away. As I reached the corner near my childhood home, I heard a familiar voice. Michael, is that really you? I turned around. Mrs. Margaret Wilson stood outside her small house, holding a basket of flowers, her eyes filled with tears. My goodness, she whispered. You're alive. I forced a weak smile. Good morning, Mrs. Wilson. She hurried toward me. I can't believe it. I wish I couldn't either, I replied. She looked around carefully before lowering her voice. Come inside. A few minutes later, she placed a cup of hot tea in front of me. You deserve the truth. I looked at her. What truth? She sighed deeply. Your letters. My heart skipped. My letters. She nodded. They kept coming. I leaned forward. What do you mean? For almost 3 years after you left, the mailman delivered your letters every month. I stared at her. I wrote every chance I had. I know. Emily never answered, because she never saw them. I felt my hand shake. What are you saying? Mrs. Wilson looked down. I saw your mother collecting those letters herself. I couldn't breathe. No, I'm sorry. There has to be some mistake. There wasn't. I slowly stood. My mother hid them? She nodded with tears in her eyes. Every single one. I pressed both hands against the table. Why? I asked her once. What did she say? She told me that soldiers disappear all the time. She believed you weren't coming home. I laughed bitterly. So she decided for me. Mrs. Wilson stayed silent. I whispered. Emily thought I stopped writing. Yes. And everyone believed I was dead. That's what your parents kept telling people. I closed my eyes. My own family buried me while I was still alive. Mrs. Wilson gently touched my arm. I'm so sorry. What about Daniel? She hesitated. He visited Emily often. I already knew the answer, but I asked anyway. What happened? He comforted her. For how long? Months became years. I looked away, and then he proposed. I swallowed hard. Did Emily love him? Mrs. Wilson sighed. I don't think she ever stopped loving you. Then why? Because she believed you abandoned her. Those words cut deeper than any wound I had received in the military. I never stopped fighting come home. I know. I wrote to her. I know. I carried her picture everywhere. I know. Tears blurred my vision. None of it mattered. Mrs. Wilson reached into a drawer and handed me a faded envelope. The mailman dropped this by mistake years ago. I recognized my own handwriting immediately. My name, Emily's address. The envelope had never been opened. I held it like it was made of glass. This should have reached her. It should have. I carefully placed it inside my backpack. Thank you for telling me. You deserve the truth. As I walked toward the door, she quietly said, Emily asked about you for years. I stopped. She cried more than you know. I didn't answer. That evening, I found myself standing beside the old lake where Emily and I had planned our future before I enlisted. The water was calm. The sunset painted the sky orange. Then I heard soft footsteps. Michael. I turned. Emily stood only a few feet away. Her eyes were already filled with tears. I wasn't sure you'd come, she whispered. I almost didn't. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, she said, I'm sorry. I looked at the water. So am I? She wiped her face. I thought you left me. I never did. I waited. I know. I wrote every week. I know. She frowned. How do you know? Mrs. Wilson told me everything. Emily covered her mouth. My God, my letters never reached you. She slowly shook her head. I never received one. My family hid them. She began crying harder. I would have waited. I believe you. I loved you. I know. I still do. Those words nearly broke me. She looked into my eyes. But I have a son now. I nodded silently. He needs me. I know. I can't destroy his life. I understand. I never wanted this. I know. She stepped closer. Can you ever forgive me? I looked at her for a long moment. I don't even know how to forgive myself for surviving long enough to come home. She reached for my hand. I gently stepped back. If I stay here, I whispered, I'll keep living in the past. Tears streamed down her face. I'll always be sorry. I forced a small smile. And I'll always remember the girl who promised to wait. I turned away before she could see my own tears. Behind me, I heard her crying, but I didn't look back. Some goodbyes only become real when you refuse to take one last glance. As I walked into the darkness, I realized the battlefield had never been the hardest place to survive. Home was. For days, I wandered without knowing where I belonged. My hometown no longer felt like home, and every street reminded me of the life I had lost. There was only one person I believed would still see me as the man I used to be, Colonel James Walker. When I stepped into his office, he looked at me for a second before breaking into a smile. Michael, you're alive. He shook my hand so firmly that I almost forgot everything that had happened. What brings you here, son? I tried to answer, but the words refused to come. Finally, I whispered, I don't have a home anymore. He listened without interrupting as I told him everything. My return, the wedding photo, the lies, and the years that had been stolen from me. When I finished, he sat silently for a long moment. Then he opened a cabinet and placed a sealed military package on the desk. I've been waiting for the right time to give you this. I looked at him, confused. What's inside? Open it. My hands trembled as I broke the seal. Inside were dozens of envelopes. Every one carried my handwriting. Every one had been returned unopened. Across each envelope were the words no soldier ever wants to see. Returned. Recipient report sender deceased. Asterisk, asterisk. I couldn't breathe. So every letter. Colonel Walker nodded. You never stop writing. No, they never stopped lying. I closed my eyes, trying to hold back the tears. 7 years, hundreds of memories, countless promises, all buried beneath one terrible lie. The colonel placed a hand on my shoulder. Listen to me carefully. I looked up. You survived a war. I don't feel like I did. Because this battle is different. I lower my head. I want answers. I know. I want justice. I know. I want them to feel what I feel. He remained silent for a moment before speaking again. Be careful. I frowned. Why? Because revenge built on hate creates another battlefield. His words stayed with me. He reached back into the package and pulled out another envelope. This one isn't from your family. I opened it slowly. It was an official recommendation from the military. A veterans rehabilitation organization wanted me to lead a new program helping injured soldiers rebuild their lives. I stared at the letter. They chose me. They chose the man who never gave up. I laughed bitterly. I don't even know who I am anymore. Colonel Walker smiled. Then maybe it's time to find out. For the first time since returning home, I felt something I thought I'd lost forever. Purpose. Before leaving, the colonel saluted me. I returned the salute without saying a word. Some respect doesn't need words. That evening, before leaving town, I made one final stop. The old oak tree still stood beside the lake. Emily and I had carved our initials into its trunk years before I left the military. The carving had faded, just like the future we once promised each other. I reached into my pocket and held the engagement ring that had traveled with me through every mission. For years, I believed it represented hope. Now it represented a life that no longer existed. I placed the ring gently inside the hollow of the old tree. No more waiting, I whispered. No more looking back. As I walked away, I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel healed. But for the first time since coming home, I finally took a step toward a different future. Sometimes the hardest mission isn't surviving the war. It's learning how to live after it. Leaving my hometown wasn't running away. It was survival. Every street reminded me of a promise that had been broken, and every memory tried to pull me back into a life that no longer belonged to me. So I accepted the position at a veterans rehabilitation center in another city. On my first day, I wondered if I was the right person for the job. How could someone who felt so broken help others heal? That's when I met Sarah. She greeted me with a warm smile and said, "Welcome. Around here, nobody fights alone." I nodded politely, but deep inside, I wasn't sure I believed her. The days were long. I listened to veterans who had lost legs, friends, families, and dreams. One man looked at me and asked, "Do the nightmares ever stop?" I didn't know how to answer. Instead, I admitted, "I'm still waiting for mine to end." He smiled sadly. So we're both healing. That conversation stayed with me. Day after day, I realized something important. None of us needed someone with perfect answers. We just needed someone willing to listen. Sarah noticed a change before I did. One afternoon, she handed me a cup of coffee and asked, "When was the last time you thought about yourself instead of the people who hurt you?" I laughed quietly. "I don't remember." She looked directly at me. "Then that's where your healing begins." Her words were simple, but they hit harder than I expected. For years, I had measured my value by whether my family loved me, whether Emily waited, whether I could somehow undo the past. I finally understood that my future couldn't depend on people who had already made their choices. Helping other veterans slowly changed me. Every success story reminded me that pain didn't have to be the end of someone's life. Sometimes it became the beginning of a stronger one. Back in my hometown, life kept moving without me. I heard that silence had started replacing laughter inside my family's house. The truth about the missing letters was becoming impossible to ignore. Old questions were turning into painful arguments. Emily began looking at the past differently. Daniel could no longer hide behind excuses. For a brief moment, I thought about going back. Part of me wanted answers. Part of me wanted justice. But another part finally whispered something I had never allowed myself to hear. Keep walking. So I did. I chose not to interrupt lives that were already falling apart under the weight of their own decisions. Revenge no longer felt like victory. Peace did. One evening, after another long day at the center, I stood outside watching the sunset. Sarah walked over and asked, "Do you miss home?" I smiled for a moment before answering. I missed the home I believed existed. She nodded. "There's a difference." "There is. And what will you do now?" I looked toward the horizon. "I'll build a new one." For the first time in years, those words felt real. The war had changed me. The betrayal had nearly destroyed me. But neither would decide the rest of my story. That choice would finally be mine. Almost a year passed before I heard anything about my family. By then, my days looked completely different. Every morning, I walked into the rehabilitation center with a purpose. Every conversation with a wounded veteran reminded me that healing wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about refusing to let the past control the future. For the first time in years, I wasn't surviving. I was living. One afternoon, Sarah walked into my office carrying a folder. "You've been invited to speak at the National Veterans Recovery Conference." I looked up in surprise. "Me?" She smiled. "You've helped hundreds of veterans rebuild their lives." "I was only doing my job." She laughed softly. "No, Michael, you gave people hope." I looked at the invitation for a long moment. A year earlier, I had been sleeping on a bench inside an abandoned train station. Now, people wanted to hear my story. Life really could change when you refuse to give up. A few days later, my phone rang. The caller ID showed an old neighbor from my hometown. I almost ignored it. Instead, I answered, "Hello, Michael, it's Mrs. Wilson. It's good to hear your voice. I wish I were calling with better news." My heart grew heavy. "What happened?" She sighed. "Your family's falling apart." I stayed silent. She continued, "Your father's investment plans failed." I frowned. "Investment plans?" "He convinced Daniel to put nearly everything into risky business deals. And they lost almost all of it." I closed my eyes. "So the business is collapsing." "Yes. What about everyone else?" "The house has become a battlefield." I didn't know what to say. Mrs. Wilson spoke gently. "I'm not calling so you'll feel happy. I know. I'm calling because the truth finally came out." My heart skipped. "What truth?" "Emily found the letters." For several seconds, I couldn't speak. "She found them?" "All of them." "How?" "She was cleaning the attic." I slowly sat down. There was an old wooden box hidden behind some storage shelves. My hands tightened around the phone. The letters were still sealed. Every single one. I imagined Emily opening the first envelope, then the second, then the third. Letter after letter proving I had never stopped writing. Proving I had never stopped loving her. Mrs. Wilson's voice became quieter. "I've never heard someone cry like that." I looked out the window. "What happened next?" She confronted Daniel. And they argued for hours. My chest felt tight. What did he say? At first, he denied everything. But he finally admitted the truth. I closed my eyes. Mrs. Wilson continued. "He confessed that your parents believed it would be easier if everyone accepted you were gone." I whispered, "Unbelievable." Emily asked why nobody told her. I could almost hear the pain in her voice through Mrs. Wilson's words. "What did my mother say?" Mrs. Wilson hesitated. She admitted she was afraid. Afraid of what? She thought the family would become the subject of gossip if Emily waited forever. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. So reputation mattered more than truth. There was silence. Finally, Mrs. Wilson answered, "Yes." I took a slow breath. "And Emily?" She said the marriage had been built on lies. Those words echoed in my mind, not because they gave me satisfaction, but because they confirmed what I had spent years trying to accept. Lies never disappear. They simply wait for the right moment to return. After ending the call, I sat quietly in my office. Sarah knocked gently before stepping inside. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "In a way, I have." I told her everything. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked one question. "How do you feel?" I thought about it carefully. A year ago, I would have wanted revenge. And now, I just feel sad. She nodded. "That's growth." A week later, I stood backstage at the National Veterans Recovery Conference. Hundreds of people filled the auditorium. Military officers, doctors, families, veterans. Someone adjusted my microphone. "Ready?" I smiled nervously. "I think so." When my name was announced, the audience applauded. I walked onto the stage. For a brief second, I remembered the lonely soldier who had believed his life was over. Then I looked at the faces in front of me. I know what it feels like to lose hope. I began. The room became completely silent. I also know that the strongest people aren't the ones who never fall. They're the ones who choose to stand up one more time. As I spoke, I realized something. The people who had betrayed me no longer controlled my story. They were trapped inside the consequences of their own choices. I had found something far more valuable than revenge. I had found purpose. The family that lied to protect its image was slowly breaking apart under the weight of those lies. The life I rebuilt through honesty, service, and compassion was becoming stronger every single day. That was the lesson I carried with me. Karma never rushes. It simply arrives when the truth is ready to be seen. I never expected to see my brother again. Not after everything that had happened. Not after all the years we had lost. One rainy afternoon, the receptionist knocked on my office door. "Michael, there's someone here asking for you." "Who is it?" She hesitated. "He says his name is Daniel." For a moment, I couldn't move. Part of me wanted to tell her I wasn't there. The other part knew this day had been coming. When I stepped into the lobby, I barely recognized him. The confident man who had once seemed to have everything was gone. His shoulders were slumped. His face looked older. His eyes carried the weight of too many sleepless nights. He looked at me and quietly said, "Thanks for seeing me." I nodded toward a nearby bench. We sat in silence. Finally, he spoke. "Emily left." I didn't answer. She took Noah with her. Still, I stayed quiet. My business is gone. He let out a bitter laugh. "Dad doesn't even answer my calls anymore." The silence between us felt heavier than any argument. After a long pause, he whispered, "I deserve it." I looked at him for the first time. "What do you want from me?" He lowered his head. "Nothing." "Then why are you here?" "Because I've spent my whole life blaming everyone except myself." I waited. He took a deep breath. "When we were kids, everyone talked about you." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "You were the disciplined one. The brave one. The son Dad was proud of." I shook my head. I never saw it that way. "But I did." His voice cracked. "I was always trying to catch up. I thought if I could beat you once, just once, I'd finally matter." I felt my chest tighten. "So that's what this was." He nodded slowly. "When you left for the military, I convinced myself it was finally my chance." He looked down at his hands. "I started spending time with Emily. I told myself I was helping her. But deep inside..." He stopped speaking. "But deep inside, you wanted to win." A tear rolled down his face. "Yes." The word barely came out. "I thought if she chose me, I'd finally prove I was better." I closed my eyes. "And was it worth it?" He didn't answer right away. When he finally looked up, his eyes were filled with regret. I lost everything. For a long time, neither of us spoke. I realized something strange. I had imagined this moment 100 different ways. I thought I'd feel satisfied, victorious, maybe even happy. Instead, I just felt tired. Hatred had been living inside me for too long. It had become heavier than the betrayal itself. Daniel looked at me and quietly asked, "Can you ever forgive me?" I thought about the question. Forgiveness would never erase the lies. It wouldn't give me back the years I had lost. It wouldn't change the choices he had made. But holding on to anger wouldn't change them either. I finally answered, "I forgive you." He stared at me in disbelief. "You do?" I nodded. "Not because you've earned it." His eyes filled with tears. "And not because I forgot what happened." He lowered his head. "I understand. I forgive you because I don't want to carry this pain for the rest of my life." The rain continued falling outside. Neither of us smiled. Neither of us celebrated. Some wounds are simply too deep for that. As Daniel stood to leave, he paused. "I don't expect us to be brothers again." I looked at him quietly. "I don't know what will become." He nodded. "Neither do I." He extended his hand. After a brief hesitation, I shook it, not to erase the past, but to stop letting it control my future. I watched him disappear into the rain. For years, I believed victory meant watching the people who hurt me suffer. That day, I learned something different. Real victory begins the moment you stop allowing someone else's mistakes to define your life. And for the first time since coming home, my heart finally felt a little lighter. Some goodbyes don't happen in anger. They happen in silence. A week after Daniel left my office, I received a simple message. Asterisk. "Can we meet one last time?" Asterisk. It was from Emily. For several minutes, I stared at the screen. Part of me wanted to ignore it. Another part knew that some chapters of life can only end when both people are ready to close the book. We agreed to meet at the old lake, where we had once dreamed about our future. When I arrived, she was already there. She looked at me with the same gentle eyes I remembered, only now they carried years of regret. Without saying a word, she stepped forward and held out a small velvet box. "I think this belongs to you." I opened it slowly. Inside was an engagement ring I had hidden inside the old oak tree years ago. I looked at her in surprise. "How did you find it?" She smiled sadly. "Mrs. Wilson found it while walking near the lake." I lowered my eyes to the ring. I never thought I'd see it again. Neither did I. For a long moment, we simply stood there, listening to the wind move through the trees. Finally, Emily spoke. I've replayed those 7 years in my mind 1,000 times. I stayed quiet. If I had known the truth. She stopped to wipe away a tear. "I would have waited." I nodded gently. "I believe you." She looked at me. "I never stopped loving you." Those words would have meant everything to me once. Now they only reminded me of how much time had passed. "I loved you too," I said softly. She took a slow breath. "I still do." I looked out across the water before answering. "I think a part of me always will." Tears rolled down her face. Then, "Is there any chance I could start over?" The question hung between us. Years ago, I would have said yes without hesitation. But life had changed us both. I looked into her eyes and realized I wasn't seeing the young woman who had waved goodbye as I left for military service. She wasn't looking at the young man who had promised to come home. We had both become strangers shaped by pain. I smiled gently. "We're not the same people anymore." She lowered her head. "I know. I don't blame you for feeling lonely. I blame myself every day. I don't blame you for being afraid. But love needs trust." She closed her eyes, and ours was broken. I nodded, not by one mistake, but by years of silence and lies. She whispered, "I'm sorry. I know. I wish I could change everything." "So do I." Neither of us cried loudly. Neither of us argued. Some heartbreak doesn't need raised voices. It only needs honesty. Emily looked at me one last time. "I hope you find someone who gives you the happiness I couldn't." I smiled. "I hope you find peace too." She stepped closer and wrapped me in a brief hug. It wasn't the embrace of two people beginning again. It was the embrace of two people finally letting go. When we stepped apart, I placed the ring back into its box. "I think I'll keep this." She nodded. "As a memory?" I looked toward the lake. "No, as a reminder." "A reminder of what?" "That love is precious, but trust is priceless." She smiled through her tears. "I'll remember that." As the sun began to set, we walked away in opposite directions. Neither of us looked back. Some stories aren't meant to have the ending we once imagined, but that doesn't mean they end without meaning. Sometimes the greatest act of love is having the courage to say goodbye. 1 year can change a life, not because it erases the past, but because it teaches you how to carry it. As I stood behind the stage, waiting for my name to be announced, I looked down at the small ring resting in my hand. For years, I believed it was a symbol of the future I had lost. Today, I finally understood what it truly meant. It wasn't a reminder of heartbreak. It was proof that I had survived it. The announcer smiled. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Captain Michael Carter." The audience applauded as I stepped onto stage. Hundreds of young veterans looked back at me. Some carried visible scars. Others carried wounds no one could see. I recognized both. I took a deep breath and began. When I came home from war, I believed I had lost everything. The room fell silent. I thought betrayal would define the rest of my life. I paused. I was wrong. Faces across the audience watched carefully. I learned that the people who hurt us don't get to decide who we become. I looked around the room. They only decide who they become. The applause was gentle. I continued. We cannot choose what happens to us, but we can always choose what happens inside us. For a brief moment, my eyes found my family, sitting quietly near the back. My mother was wiping away tears. My father stared at the floor. The pain on their faces wasn't something I had wished for. It was simply the weight of choices they could never take back. Daniel met my eyes. He gave a small nod. It wasn't another request for forgiveness. It was gratitude that I had listened when he apologized. I returned the nod. Nothing more needed to be said. A few seats away, Emily smiled softly. There was sadness in her expression, but there was peace too. For the first time in years, neither of us was holding on to what could never be. When my speech ended, the audience rose to their feet. The applause echoed through the hall, not for my pain, but for the hope that had grown from it. After the ceremony, I walked alone toward the memorial garden outside the rehabilitation center. Names of fallen soldiers were carved into polished stone, heroes who never had the chance to come home. I opened the small velvet box one final time. The engagement ring caught the afternoon sunlight. I smiled. You carried me through the darkest years of my life. My voice was barely above a whisper. But I don't need to carry you anymore. I gently placed the ring inside the memorial display created to honor sacrifice, resilience, and remembrance. It belonged there now, not as a symbol of a broken promise, but as a reminder that even the deepest heartbreak can lead us toward a greater purpose. I stepped back and looked at the memorial. For the first time in many years, I felt completely at peace. The future waiting in front of me was no longer shadowed by regret. It was filled with possibility. As I walked away, I didn't think about revenge. I didn't think about betrayal. I didn't think about everything I had lost. I thought about the lives still waiting to be changed, the veterans who needed hope, the families that needed healing, the people searching for a reason to believe tomorrow could be better than yesterday. That had become my mission, and it was far more important than anything I had left behind. Life had taught me a lesson no battlefield ever could. Real strength isn't measured by how hard you fight. It's measured by how gently you choose to live after the fighting is over. That was the man I had become, not because the world had been kind to me, but because I refused to let its cruelty become my identity. And as the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, I walked toward my future with an open heart, finally free.